The snow had been falling for hours, turning the entire city into a frozen maze of white streets and deserted sidewalks. Amara was heavily pregnant and already struggling through painful contractions, but she knew she had to reach the hospital before her baby arrived. Then, while passing a dark alley, she heard something beneath the howling wind, a faint, desperate cry. She stopped, placed one trembling hand over her stomach, and listened again. There it was, the sound of a child crying. Despite the pain shooting through her body, Amara stepped into the freezing alley and discovered a little boy lying helplessly against a wall, covered in snow, his lips turning blue and his body barely moving. Fear immediately filled her heart because she was already in active labor, but she couldn't leave him there to die. Without thinking about herself or the baby growing inside her, Amara removed her warm coat and wrapped it tightly around the freezing child. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Please, just stay with me," she whispered as the boy slowly opened his eyes and weakly said one word, "Kai." Amara continued talking to him, trying to keep him conscious while her contractions became stronger and the blizzard grew more violent around them. She knew every second mattered, yet she refused to leave the helpless child alone. What she didn't know was that Kai wasn't an ordinary boy. He was the son of one of the city's most powerful billionaires. And the decision Amara made in that freezing alley would soon change all of their lives forever. The emergency call finally went through, and within minutes, distant sirens could be heard fighting their way through the storm. But Amara was still on the ground beside Kai, holding him tightly beneath her coat. Her own contractions were now coming closer together, and every wave of pain forced her to close her eyes and breathe through it. Yet whenever Kai began to slip toward unconsciousness, she immediately spoke to him again. "Kai, look at me. Don't fall asleep." The little boy struggled to keep his eyes open and whispered that he was cold, and Amara pulled him closer, using her own body to shield him from the wind. She had no idea how long she had been there when suddenly another contraction struck with such force that she cried out, but she still refused to move away from him. Finally, the rescue team reached the alley and rushed toward them, immediately realizing that Kai was dangerously cold and that Amara was in active labor. One paramedic wrapped Kai in emergency blankets while another helped Amara to her feet. But before they carried the boy away, Kai reached weakly toward her and whispered, "Don't leave me." Amara squeezed his hand and promised, "I'm right here." What nobody in that alley knew was that Kai's father had already been desperately searching for his missing son. And when the rescuers reported that a pregnant woman had found him and stayed beside him throughout the storm, the billionaire father would soon learn that a complete stranger had protected his son while putting her own life at risk. The ambulance rushed through the snow-covered streets, while Amara struggled through another painful contraction. But even in her condition, her eyes remained fixed on Kai, who was lying beneath the emergency blankets. The paramedics kept telling her to focus on herself because her baby was coming soon, but Amara kept asking if the boy was breathing. When they finally reached the hospital, Kai was immediately taken into emergency care, while Amara was rushed toward the delivery ward. Moments later, Kai's father, J1, arrived at the hospital in a panic after receiving the news that his son had been found unconscious in the storm. He stood outside the emergency room demanding answers, and when the doctor finally told him that Kai was severely hypothermic but expected to recover, J1's relief was quickly replaced by confusion. "Who found him?" he asked. The doctor explained that a pregnant woman had discovered Kai in the alley and stayed beside him despite being in active labor herself. J1 fell silent when he heard that she had removed her own coat and wrapped it around his son. Then came the detail that shook him most. She had remained with Kai for nearly 23 minutes before rescuers arrived, even while enduring contractions. J1 looked toward the delivery ward, realizing that somewhere behind those doors was a woman who had risked everything to save his only son, and for the first time that night, the billionaire who was used to solving every problem with money had no idea how he could ever repay what she had done. J1 stood outside the delivery ward, unable to sit still, while doctors continued working to stabilize Kai and prepare Amara for delivery. Every few minutes, he asked for an update, but the answer remained the same: Kai was improving, and the woman who had saved him was now in labor. When a doctor finally stepped out and told J1 that Amara had delivered a healthy baby girl, a strange silence settled over him. He had expected gratitude to be simple, something he could express with money or a gift, but after hearing what she had sacrificed, it felt much deeper than that. He immediately instructed his chief of staff to find out everything about Amara. But when the information arrived, J1 discovered that she was a hardworking data analyst with no family nearby, no emergency contact available, and only limited savings. The report explained her circumstances. But J1 realized that paperwork could never describe the woman who had taken off her only warm coat in a blizzard while carrying a child of her own just to keep his son alive. He ordered his team to settle her medical expenses, secure her housing for several months, and arrange transportation for her after discharge, but he also made one thing clear: she should never be pressured into accepting anything. Meanwhile, Kai slowly opened his eyes in the hospital room and asked the first question that mattered to him: where is the woman who saved me? Kai's condition was finally stable, but the first thing he asked when he opened his eyes was, where is the woman who saved me? J1 stood beside his son's hospital bed and gently told him that Amara was in another part of the hospital after giving birth to her baby girl. Kai immediately asked if he could see her, but the doctors wanted him to rest. Meanwhile, Amara lay exhausted in the maternity ward, holding her newborn daughter close to her chest. She had survived the terrifying night, but she still kept thinking about the little boy she had found alone in the snow. She didn't know his family, his wealth, or his identity. All she knew was that a frightened child had needed someone, and she had stayed. Later, J1 received a detailed report about Amara and discovered that she had no family in the country, no one available to help her, and very limited financial security. The information made him realize that the woman who had protected his son was facing her own struggles. He quietly ordered his staff to make sure her hospital expenses were covered and that she would have a safe place to live after leaving the hospital. But he also gave one important instruction: Amara must never be forced to accept anything. He wanted her to have a choice, because no amount of money could repay the courage she had shown that night. The next morning, Kai was finally strong enough to leave his hospital bed for a short visit, and his first request was to see Amara. When he entered her room, he stopped at the doorway and looked at the tiny baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. Amara smiled when she saw him and asked how he was feeling. Much better, Kai said quietly. Because of you. He then stepped closer and thanked her again, but Amara gently shook her head and told him she would have done the same for any child who needed help. Kai looked at the baby and asked her name. Nadia, Amara replied. Kai smiled and said, she's lucky to have you. Standing a few steps away, J1 watched the exchange in silence. He had spent his entire life believing that every problem had a solution if you had enough money, influence, or power. But this woman had done something his wealth could never have commanded. She had protected his son without knowing who he was. After Kai returned to his room, J1 finally approached Amara. He introduced himself simply as Kai's father and thanked her personally. Amara listened quietly, but before he could offer anything, she said, I didn't save your son because he was yours. I saved him because he was a child. Those words stayed with J1 long after he left the room. A few days later, Kai was discharged from the hospital, but he had not forgotten Amara. Before leaving, he asked his father if he could visit her again. J1 agreed, but this time he wanted to understand the woman behind the act of courage. He knew the report his staff had prepared could tell him where Amara lived, what she did for work, and what financial difficulties she faced, but it could never tell him who she really was. When J1 eventually met Amara again, he thanked her for saving his son and explained that he wanted to help with her expenses. Amara listened carefully before telling him that she appreciated the gesture, but she did not want her life to become an obligation. J1 respected her answer. For the first time, there was no billionaire trying to solve a problem with money and no woman being treated like someone who needed rescuing. There were simply two parents standing in the same room, connected by one extraordinary night. J1 looked at Amara and quietly admitted, I should have asked first. Amara appreciated his honesty, and something changed between them. Not friendship yet, not trust completely, but the beginning of something built on respect. 3 weeks after the blizzard, Kai visited Amara again, this time carrying a handmade card for Nadia. He had carefully written her name in both English and Korean, clearly taking his time to make every letter perfect. When Amara opened the door, Kai proudly handed her the card and said, I made this for your baby. Amara smiled and invited him inside, and for the first time, The apartment felt less like a place where a stranger had once been rescued and more like a place where two families were slowly becoming connected. Kai talked about school, showed Nadia a small drawing, and even told Amara that he remembered something she had said to him in the alley about mathematics. Amara laughed when she realized he had remembered every word she had used to keep him awake that night. Later, Jae-won arrived to pick Kai up, but before leaving, Kai hugged Amara and promised he would visit again. Amara watched him walk away and realized that the connection between them had become something neither of them had planned. It was no longer simply about the night in the snow, it was about trust, kindness, and the quiet bond that had grown from one impossible moment. As the weeks passed, the connection between Amara and Kai became something neither of them had expected. Kai continued visiting with small gifts and handmade cards, while Amara treated him exactly as she would any other child without being impressed by his father's wealth or expecting anything in return. Jae-won began to notice the difference in his son. Kai seemed more thoughtful after the night in the snow, more aware of people around him, and strangely determined to remember every lesson Amara had taught him while keeping him awake in that freezing alley. One afternoon, Jae-won came to Amara's apartment and admitted that he had investigated her life because he needed to know who had saved his son. Amara didn't become angry. Instead, she simply asked, "What do you need from me?" Jae-won paused before answering, realizing that what he really wanted was for Kai to be able to visit her without everything becoming complicated by money or status. Amara agreed, but she made one condition: Kai had to come as himself, not as the billionaire's son. Jae-won respected her completely. Before leaving, he told her that Kai often talked about her and still remembered the things she had said to him that night. Amara smiled, realizing that perhaps the blizzard had not only saved Kai's life, it had created a bond between people who would never have met otherwise. Months later, Amara sat in her small apartment with Nadia sleeping peacefully beside her when there was a gentle knock at the door. When she opened it, Kai was standing there with Jae-won, holding another handmade card. This time, the card was not only for Nadia, it was for Amara too. Kai handed it to her and said, "You saved me when nobody else was there, and I will never forget you." Amara hugged him tightly, realizing that the frightened boy she had found freezing in the snow had become part of her life in a way she could never have imagined. Jae-won stood nearby, no longer trying to repay Amara with money or solve her life with his wealth. He simply looked at her and said, "You showed my son what courage really looks like." Amara smiled and replied, "Sometimes people don't need saving. Sometimes they just need someone to stay." That night in the blizzard had begun with a woman in labor finding a dying child in the snow, but it ended by bringing two families together through compassion, honesty, and a kindness that expected nothing in return. Amara had lost her coat that night, but she gained something far more valuable: a bond that money could never buy. And Kai would carry that lesson for the rest of his life: the greatest heroes aren't always the richest or the strongest. Sometimes they're simply the people who refuse to walk away when someone needs them most. If this emotional story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful stories of hope, courage, and unexpected kindness. And tell us in the comments, would you have stopped to save Kai, even if you were in Amara's situation?